We're good? All right. This is lesson number 8 in the divided kingdom. And today we're going to study Asa in the time that we have. Now, if you'll look, Asa is the third king of Judah. And on the good evil, it has him as being a good king. And he is a good king in a lot of ways. The good is relative to some of the bad kings. And when you get kings like Omri, you get kings like Jeroboam, you get kings like Ahab. If you're not Hitler, you look pretty good compared to them, because these are really evil, wicked kings. Yes, good by what standard? And so Asa, though, is a relatively good king. And we've covered all the history of Judah and Israel in 1st and 2nd Kings, with some highlights brought in from 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, today and next week, I want to go back and try to focus on 6 individuals in particular. This includes the 4 good kings of Judah and 2 prophets to Israel. The 4 kings that I label as good, now this has more. I think this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, I only have 4 good kings, and the 4 good kings that I have are Asa, Jehoshaphat, which both of those are listed there, Hezekiah, so I don't consider Jehoash a good king, or Amaziah, or Azariah. So you got to get all the way down to Hezekiah before I come up with my third one. And then the 4th and last one is Josiah. All right, so, but the others are not totally wicked that they list as good kings, but they don't make my cut. If I'm making a good team, they're substitutes. They're not on the first team, okay? And the 2 prophets, of course, are Elijah and Elisha. So let's jump right into the study of our first king, King Asa of the nation of Judah. And I'll entitle this study, A Study in Faith and Reform. A Study in Faith and Reform. Now, King Asa, who ruled over the kingdom of Judah from approximately 913 to 873 BC, is a significant figure in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of 1st and 2nd, in 1st Kings and 2nd Chronicles. His reign is marked by religious reforms, military victories, and challenges that highlight the complexities of faith, leadership, and divine intervention. Asa's story is a testament to the role of the king in guiding the people toward righteousness, and how their actions, rooted in faith and obedience to God, can shape the course of a nation. Now, I don't like getting into politics. As a matter of fact, I refuse to do so. But when an example stands out as clearly as it does in America today, I can't avoid it. I'm not preaching that Trump is Christ and that Biden and Obama are the Antichrist. I'm not doing that. But I will say this. There's one man that has prayer multiple times a week in the White House, and there are presidents who have rejected prayer completely during their tenure. We know who they are by name if we sit here and think about it over the last 40 years. And you can tell the difference in those presidents that were for religious freedom and were for prayer and tried their best to do what they thought was an ethical thing, be it based on God's standards, intentionally or not. And then we have people that had no respect whatsoever for God's ethics, God's morals, and God's law. And as a matter of fact, they went out of their way to attack those ethics, morals, and laws. For example, a clear example of that is homosexuality. There are presidents that pushed homosexuality, and there are presidents that say homosexuals have rights as citizens, but we're not going to push their agenda on the American people. Valley and I today, my daughter Valley, we were talking, and I told her that I'm 53 years old as of a few weeks from now, and I've never seen 2 homosexual men together in my whole life. I never have. 2 men together, never seen it. Now, if you watch TV, you would expect it to be on every corner and every restaurant and every movie theater, because they're everywhere on TV. But in my lifetime, I've never seen two men together. My point on saying that is this: certain parts of America promote sin, and certain parts of America resist it. And where the president falls on one of those two sides makes a big difference in how God blesses this nation. You get people that lead America down the homosexual, transgender road, and lead people down an immoral road, and God withdraws his blessings from America to the degree that he would have granted them. You take a president or a leader or leaders here in America, and they try to do the right thing, then we see God's blessings on America more strongly, more fully. And a lot of that too has to do with how we treat the nation of Israel. Certain presidents are pro-Israel, certain presidents are anti-Israel. Certain presidents go out of their way to support Israel, certain presidents go out of their way to tear down Israel. And we know who those individuals are. So the point on this is the king or the leader of a nation can guide his people and will guide his people in one direction or the other, either into a righteous or an unrighteous direction. And it can shape the course of a nation. Let's look first at Asa's early life and his ascension to the throne. Asa was the son of King Abijah and the grandson of Rehoboam, the first king of the divided kingdom of Judah. When Asa ascended to the throne at a young age, the kingdom of Judah was entrenched in idolatry and moral decline as a result of the previous king's actions, including his own father. The people of Judah had fallen into sin, were worshiping foreign gods, and practicing idolatry, which angered the Lord. Asa's reign, however, marked a radical shift in the religious landscape of Judah. So Asa was a good king, but one of the most notable accomplishments of his reign was his religious reforms. As described in 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 11 through 15, and 2 Chronicles chapters 14 and 15, Asa took decisive action to eradicate idolatry and restore the worship of the one true God. Now notice what I just said. In 1 Kings 15, it's 4 verses that describe his religious reform. In 2 Chronicles, it's 2 entire chapters. Now this is where you'll begin to see a difference between Kings and Chronicles, where the emphasis is. There's a little silly saying that I use sometimes: you got to put the emphasis on the right syllable. And that's exactly what Chronicles and Kings does. One puts the emphasis on one part of the king's reign, and one puts the emphasis on another part of the king's reign. And Kings, the book of Kings, doesn't emphasize to the degree that Chronicles does the religious reforms of King Asa. Now, what did King Asa do? He removed the foreign idols. He smashed the sacred stones. He cut down the Asherah poles, which were symbols of fertility gods that were widely worshipped in Judah. Asa also deposed his grandmother, Maacah, who had made an idol in the form of an Asherah pole and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Asa's reforms were not just political, they were deeply spiritual. He encouraged the people of Judah to seek the Lord with all their hearts and to keep God's commandments. Asa called for the removal of idol worship, promoting the exclusive worship of Jehovah Yahweh. In so doing, Asa sought to restore the blessings of the covenant relationship between Judah and God, calling the people to repentance and faithfulness. And that's another important thing. Asa wanted the blessings of the covenant. All right, he wanted the blessings of the covenant. The covenant was made between Israel, the people of Israel, in this case the nation of Judah, and God Almighty. Asa didn't want the covenant. The covenant had already been made. He wanted the blessings of the covenant, and Deuteronomy in particular told what was required to get those blessings. Now, we talked about this in Kingdom and Covenants, and the great covenant that deals with God's blessings on the nation of Israel is the Palestinian covenant. And remember what it said. I'm making a covenant, it's an unconditional covenant. You will get the land of Israel, but you'll only get the blessings of the land of Israel if you keep my commandments, and if you don't, you'll get the curses. You're going to get the land. The question is, will you enjoy it, or will you be removed from it temporarily by not keeping my covenant? If you keep my covenant, not only will you be in the land, but you'll get the blessings. So Asa wanted the blessings restored to the nation of Judah. And so he called for repentance and faithfulness. Now, Asa was also known for his military victories. During Asa's reign, Judah experienced a period of military success, and it's attributed to God's favor. One of the most notable victories came during the war with the Cushites, who are the Ethiopians. The Ethiopian king Zerah led a massive army against Judah. According to the text, the Ethiopian soldiers numbered over 1 million. 1 million. Now, I take the Bible literally. I take the Bible as a historical, factual book. So out of Africa, there came 1 million soldiers against the nation of Judah. Now remember, Judah, the nation, is only made up of 2 tribes. The largest tribe in Israel, the tribe of Judah, and the smallest tribe in the tribe of Israel, in the nation of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. It's not a massive nation. It's a relatively small nation. And they're coming up against 1 million soldiers. In this time of overwhelming danger, Asa turned to God in prayer and called out for divine assistance. Now, they say in foxholes there's no such thing as an atheist. When you see 1 million soldiers coming at you, you're going to do one of 2 things. You're going to run, or you're going to call out to God for help, because the odds are against you. You have no chance. You're being attacked with an overwhelming force. But Asa, I will give him credit, did not run. He went to the Lord instead. And Asa's faith was rewarded when God gave Judah a decisive victory over the larger Ethiopian army. And the battle ended with the Ethiopians, the Cushites, fleeing, and the spoils of war were taken back to Judah, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 9 through 15. Now, this victory is a powerful testimony and testament to the importance of faith and the reliance on God in times of crises. Now, we could stop here and we could make plenty of practical applications from this. When things go bad, when things look bad, when things are not where they need to be, you've got 2 choices. You can turn to self and flee because you know you can't win, or you can turn to God and stand. Those are your 2 choices. Michelle and I, we worked with dogs for many years, and what we did was we put dogs sometimes in defense, and we would do it in small increments. Now, what that means is you put a dog in a situation where he's losing, and you let him overcome that situation until he wins a victory, and then he becomes braver the next time, because when he's put in that bad situation, he learns to bite harder. But you can put a dog in full defense, and what you do, now we never did this with dogs because we didn't have to. We had a much more civil system. But some of the old trainers, what they would do is they would chain a dog to a pole, and they would attack the dog. And the dog couldn't get away. And they had on bite suits so the dog couldn't defend himself successfully. And they would continue to attack the dog until the dog would pass out because he couldn't run away and he couldn't attack successfully, and he would pass out from sheer frustration and fear because he realized he was losing. And then they would come back to the dog, and they would start to come at him. And if the dog looked at him instead of running away, the decoy would run away. Then if they came to him and the dog barked, they would run away, and the dog would get braver and braver and braver. Since he had been taken to the point where he had passed out and then built back up, he believed that he could never be defeated. He believed he could never be defeated. And then you had a dog that would be reliable in all circumstances. And they do this with military dogs. Now, the reason I tell you that is because when things go bad and you seem to be chained to a pole, you have two choices. You have the choice to pass out, or you have the choice to fight back. You can't fight back in your own power and in your own strength. You'll never win. The only way you can fight back in times of crises is by turning to God and let God defend you. When Elisha and his servant were walking and they were surrounded by the Syrian army in the valley, his servant said to Elisha, he said, "Hey, we're in trouble. We're surrounded. There are literally thousands of soldiers around us. We stand no chance." And Elisha kind of laughed and said, "God, open his eyes." And he opened the boy's eyes, and he saw more of God's army surrounding the Assyrians than the Assyrians surrounding them. Now that is relying on God when you're chained to a pole. Elisha didn't run away. Elisha didn't try to fight back in his own strength. Elisha allowed God to fight back on his behalf. Okay, so Asa had military success, but he had it because he relied upon God Almighty. Asa's leadership and trust in God were key to his successes, as he did not rely solely on military might, but sought God's intervention through prayer. But Asa's reign was also filled with critical challenges and failings. Despite his many successes, Asa's reign was not without challenges. In the later years of his rule, Asa made a political alliance with King Ben-Hadad of Aram, that is Syria, seeking help against the northern kingdom of Israel. Now I want you to think about this. The 10 tribes of Israel are going to attack the 2 tribes of Judah. He had just defeated, through God's power, a 1,000,000-man army. And now Judah's coming against him, and instead of relying on the same God that overcome 1,000,000 soldiers, he goes and makes a treaty with Syria, Aram. All right? And Asa's decision to rely on foreign aid, a pagan nation, rather than trusting in God, was seen as a failure in his faith. The prophet Hanani rebuked Asa for his lack of trust in God, warning him that relying on human alliances rather than on God would lead to failure in the future. This is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verses 7 through 9. And Asa's response to the prophet's rebuke was less than ideal. Now Hanani came to Asa and he said, "You're in trouble. You've made an alliance with a pagan nation. You don't rely on God when you need to." And instead of Asa saying, "You know what? You're right. I repent. I break the alliance. Let God protect me." Asa, instead of repenting, became angry and imprisoned Hanani. Asa's later years were marked by personal and national decline as he began to rely more on his own wisdom rather than on God's guidance. This turning away from God is a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-reliance and the need to maintain faith throughout one's life, not just in a moment of crisis. So what is Asa's legacy? King Asa ultimately serves as a reflection of both the triumphs and failures of human leadership. Let's go back to modern politics. We have successes in modern politics, but those same people who lead us to success also lead us to failures. Why? Because the modern leaders of America are not Messiah. We can't put our faith in any president. We can't put our faith in any congressional leader. We have to put our faith in God. Why? Because the president, regardless of who he is, and the congressional leader, regardless of who he or she is, will ultimately fail in some areas and likely in many areas. So, His early years as king were marked by strong faith and significant reforms that helped restore righteousness in Judah, but his later years revealed the vulnerability of even the most faithful individuals to pride, self-reliance, and spiritual decline. Asa's story highlights the need for continued trust in God, the importance of obedience to his commands, and the consequences of turning away from him. Now, Asa to me is exactly the opposite of what I would have written in the story if it had been a human writing. Asa would have been a bad king at the beginning and found God and been a great king at the end. But Asa started off being a good king in the beginning in his youth, but when he got to be an older man who had seen the victories that God would grant him, Asa turned away from God. And you say, well, that's not a very realistic story until you think about the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. They saw the Red Sea parted. That would have been enough for me. Okay, God, I'm on Team Yahweh. You just parted the Red Sea and we went through on dry ground and then you drowned Pharaoh's army. I'm convinced you're God. They saw manna come down from heaven. They got to eat the food of angels. They saw the rock struck in the desert and water come out of a rock. And the list goes on. They had seen the 10 plagues in Egypt. And what did they do? When they had all of that success in their early years and they finally get to the promised land, they said, the God who split the Red Sea, the God who split the rock and gave water, the God who split heaven and gave manna, cannot overcome the giants in the land of promise. They had seen, they had enjoyed, they had experienced the power of God, and they turned their back on God in a time of crisis. That's exactly what Asa does. He sees all of God's power. He sees all of God's blessings. He experiences the victory, and as he gets older, he turns away from it. So it's not unrealistic. Now, the challenge for each of us here today, with the exception of Sadie, the challenge for each of us today is we're on the downhill side of life, not the uphill side. Sorry about that, Cleburne. We won't live to be 100 very likely. We've passed or nearer passing the halfway point of what our life will be. So the challenge for us is, will we rely on God in our later life more than we relied on God in our earlier life? That's the challenge. And Asa is a warning not to take this for granted. You can have trusted God in your 20s and 30s and failed to serve God in your 50s and 60s. The God who gave you safety and victory in your early years is the same God who can sustain you in your later years. And if you don't remember that, Asa is a warning of what can happen to you and your family. Asa's life serves as an example of power of faith and leadership. His initial reforms, his military victories, and efforts to restore true worship did make a lasting impact on the kingdom of Judah. And despite his later mistakes, Asa's commitment to God in his earlier years laid a foundation for subsequent kings who would seek to follow in his footsteps. His reign is often seen as a period of religious renewal and national restoration. Now, with these thoughts in mind, how do we sum up Asa's reign? King Asa of Judah was a ruler whose reign was marked by religious reform, military success, and personal flaws. His story, recorded in the Old Testament, is one of faith, leadership, and the consequences of turning away from God. And Asa serves as both an example of how God can use faithful leaders for his purpose and a warning about the dangers of self-sufficiency and spiritual complacency. This reminds me of the church of Ephesus. Who was Ephesus founded by? Does anybody know? What apostle? Ephesus. Paul. Who was it pastored by starting in its second decade of existence? Which apostle? No, an apostle. It was the Apostle John. John pastored Ephesus. Founded by Paul, pastored by John. And what does the Bible say about Ephesus? I know your works, that you have sound doctrine. But one thing I have against you, you have left your first love. Founded by the Apostle Paul, no greater apostle ever lived. Pastored by the Apostle John, no greater apostle ever lived. They were just great in different ways. And John said later in Revelation, you've left your first love. You've left your first love. We have to be careful. I know I'm being repetitive, but I'm being repetitive for a reason. The Bible is repetitive in this matter, so I'm going to follow the Bible's example. We have to be careful not to leave our first love. We have to be careful not to leave our passion for God and for Christ and for His church and His people in our later years. We have to be. We have to be careful to maintain. Which one would I rather you have, sound doctrine or great love for Christ? The answer is both. It takes one to have the other, but you don't exalt one at the expense of the other. There are a lot of churches in America today that are teaching churches that have no evangelistic zeal whatsoever. And there are a lot of churches that have evangelistic zeal with no depth of doctrine whatsoever. Both are wrong. Now, I'm going to brag on Brother John. He hates for me to do this, but I'm going to do it right now. He's preaching through Ruth. Find the gospel in Ruth. Find it. Find Jesus and the cross. Find God speaking. Find it. And yet every sermon he's preached on the book of Ruth in this series has ended with one thing and one thing only. The gospel. The gospel. So, it is a depth of teaching with a passion for what Christ did for us on Calvary's cross. It's balanced. It's balanced. And it ought to tender our hearts and remind us of what our relationship with God is all about. God told the Jews, write my law and put it on the forehead, put it on the cusp of your hem, put it on your doorpost, everywhere you can think of. And when you rise up, meditate on my law. And when you lay down, meditate on my law. So doctrine is important. But doctrine is not important for the sake of doctrine. Doctrine is important for realizing the holiness of God. And we ought to love the Lord who gave us such a law. All right? Now, before we leave King Asa, we need to note the story of Asa is told in both the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. The story of King Asa is recounted in 1 Kings 15, 19 through 24, 15 verses in 1 Kings 15, and 2 Chronicles in 3 chapters, chapters 14, 15, and 16. So you can see Chronicles gives a much more extended account. But there are noticeable differences in how his reign and actions are presented in the two books. The differences arise from the distinct purposes and perspectives of the authors of Kings and of Chronicles. While the book of Kings focuses more on historical and political accounts of Israel and Judah, Chronicles tends to emphasize the religious aspects, the temple, and the covenant relationship between God and His people. Now here are some of the key differences between the accounts of King Asa in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. First of all, the focus on religious reforms. In 1 Kings 15, 9 through 24, the account in Kings provides a concise overview of Asa's reign, mentioning he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but it does not go into detail about the reforms he carried out. It simply states that Asa removed the high places, the idols, and deposed his grandmother for her idolatry. It does that in one verse, in verse 13 of 1 Kings 15. The passage also briefly mentions that Asa's reign was marked by peace and that he was a good king who sought to lead Judah according to God's laws. But in 2 Chronicles 14 through 16, Asa's religious reforms are presented in much more detail, with a stronger emphasis on his zeal for the Lord. It highlights his effort to destroy idols, reform the worship of the Lord, and call the people of Judah to seek God. There's also significant focus on the covenant renewal during his reign, where Asa encouraged the people to commit to seeking the Lord and turning away from idolatry. Chronicles portrays Asa's religious actions as being directly aligned with God's will, emphasizing his role as a reformer and a spiritual leader. He comes off better in Chronicles than he does in Kings, in other words. Chronicles is not saying that he didn't fail in his later life. What Chronicles is saying is when he did what was right, God was blessing, and the covenant blessings were being poured out on Israel. Another difference between Kings and Chronicles is the battle against the Ethiopians, the Cushites. In 1 Kings 15, 16 through 22, the account in Kings mentions a conflict between Asa and King Baasha of Israel, but it does not go into detail about the military victories or any direct divine involvement. The kings of Judah and Israel are often presented in more political light in Kings, and this episode mainly serves to highlight the tense relationship between Judah and Israel. But in 2 Chronicles 14, verses 9 through 15, the battle against the Cushite army is a significant and miraculous event. The Bible recounts how the massive Ethiopian army led by King Zerah posed a serious threat to Judah, and Asa, trusting in God, prayed for divine help, and God granted him a remarkable victory, leading to the defeat of the Ethiopian army. The military victory is directly attributed to God's intervention, underscoring the theme of divine faithfulness and Asa's reliance on God rather than his own military strength. Also, the difference between the role of the prophet Hanani. In 1 Kings 15, there's no mention of a prophet named Hanani or any rebuke given to Asa for relying on foreign alliances later in his reign. The text in Kings is more focused on the political aspect of Asa's rule, with less attention given to the prophet's voice. But in 2 Chronicles 16, verses 7 through 9, the prophet Hanani plays a crucial role in rebuking Asa for his decision to ally with King Ben-Hadad of Aram against Israel rather than trusting in God as he had in times past. Hanani condemns Asa for relying on human alliances instead of seeking God's help, and prophesies that because of this alliance, Asa's kingdom would come to face challenges. Asa's anger and refusal to repent at this rebuke are highlighted in Chronicles, adding a moral and spiritual lesson to the narrative. There's also a fourth difference, and that's the emphasis on spiritual and moral character. In 1 Kings 15, the account in Kings is relatively brief and focuses on the political and military aspect of Asa's reign. It mentions that Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but it does not elaborate on his personal relationship with God or the nature of his spiritual leadership beyond a few key actions like removing the idols and the high places. But in 2 Chronicles 14 through 16, Chronicles offers deeper insight into Asa's spiritual journey. The narrative is more focused on his role as a religious reformer and his relationship to God. It emphasizes his active efforts to encourage the people of Judah to worship God properly and abandon idolatry. However, it also highlights his eventual failure to trust God completely, especially in his later years, portraying him as a king who struggled with maintaining a consistent faith. The book of Chronicles uses Asa's story to teach the importance of relying on God throughout one's life, not just in times of crisis. Now, in the final years of Asa's reign, we see another difference. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 23 and 24, the account in Kings ends with a brief statement that Asa had peace for the majority of his reign, but there's no explanation of his later years or of his decline. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, in 14 verses, the first 14 verses, Chronicles provides a more detailed account of Asa's later years. After initial success in his reign, Asa makes the fateful decision to rely on a political alliance with King Ben-Hadad of Syria rather than entrusting God for help against Israel. The prophet Hanani, as I mentioned before, does rebuke his lack of faith, and Chronicles records Asa's angry response to the prophet. It concludes with Asa's eventual death after a prolonged disease in his feet, which he did not seek God's healing for the disease. Instead, he relied on human physicians. Now, this is a simple story, but here's the question I ask. To whom do we go in our times of need in spiritual situations that are not good, spiritual disease? And to whom do we go in times of physical disease? I'm not saying there's anything with the prophets. As a matter of fact, if he'd have gone to the Lord probably would have told him to go to the doctors, not prophets. There's nothing wrong with going to the doctors. But when you go to the doctors instead of going to God to find out what his guidance would be, then you have a problem. Let me give you an example. We put 2 chairs up here a couple weeks ago, and we brought in 2 men with cancer. Why did we do that? Did we do that so they wouldn't go to the doctor? Or did we do that to seek God's will in their life for healing and to give the doctor skill and knowledge in how to treat them? And even if the doctors fail, we were asking God to work his miracle in their lives and heal them. You see, there's nothing wrong with doctors. The problem is when we put our faith in doctors. Now, those 2 men cannot be healed by doctors. How do I know that? Graveyard's full of people that die from cancer. But they can be healed by God. And we believe that, or else we wouldn't have showed up and prayed for them. And what a powerful moment that was. Asa had a problem with his feet, but his real problem was with his heart. His real problem was with his heart. If Asa had repented of his heart problem, his foot problem would have probably taken care of itself through God's blessings. Now, this relying on the physicians is the final commentary on his spiritual decline, and it contrasts his earlier faith with his later self-reliance. So let's conclude our study of the differences in Kings and Chronicles with this conclusion. The differences between the accounts of King Asa in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles primarily arise from the focus of the 2 books. Kings presents a more concise and political history, whereas Chronicles emphasizes religious and spiritual lessons. So let's pretend, and this is not far-fetched. There's 2 books on your life. One is Cleburne is an arborist. I'm going to use a proper word there. He's an arborist. He works on trees. That's a fact. And there's a book of how fair he treated people in his business. And there's a book of how ethical he was in his treatment of people. And there's a book on his actions as an arborist. But there's another book. And that book is what was his spiritual condition during that same period. The one book may look pretty good. He was a hard worker. The one book may look really good. He was a fair businessman. But the question is, how does the other book look? Now, I know Cleburne. I feel like both books are really good. I can say that with all sincerity. But the question I want to ask you personally is, how would your book look? Cleburne knows how his books would look. I know how my books would look. How would yours? Those 2 books are what matter. And King Asa is an example of one book looking pretty good and the other ultimately looking pretty bad. I wish his 2 books had matched up. Do your 2 books match up? In Chronicles, Asa's reign is portrayed as a journey of faith with significant emphasis on his reforms and the divine intervention in his military victories. However, it also shows the pitfall of his later years when he relied on human wisdom instead of trusting in God. Kings, on the other hand, offers a shorter overview with less emphasis on the personal and spiritual aspect of his reign. Together, these two accounts provide a fuller picture of Asa as a king who began his reign with great faith, but ultimately struggled with spiritual consistency. I know thy works, that you hold fast to the doctrine which I have given you. But I have somewhat against you. You have left your first love. Spiritual consistency. That's what I pray for each one of us here when we're tired. Miss Bonnie does children's church quite a bit. I don't know how you do it. I would get very tired and worn out doing that. But you do it faithfully. You have an important job. You're not corralling cats, even though it seems like it. You have young children's hearts in your hand. There may be no more important job. There may be no more important job than those ladies that go up there and do children's church. Because the seeds are planted that later result in decisions for the Lord. It's easy to get weary in doing the Lord's work, but make sure you don't get weary of doing the Lord's work. There's a vast difference. There's a vast difference. So let us each commit, no matter how insignificant it may seem in our daily walk, when we make a decision, not just at church, but in our daily lives, working at the bank or cutting a tree. Think about the effect of that decision upon the name of Christ before you make it. If you do, your books will look mighty good. If you don't, your books will look mighty inconsistent. Thank you all for coming.